Welcome to the MUFG Global Markets Podcast. I'm Haley Orr, Director within the Capital Markets Strategy Group at MUFG. I'm excited to be here today with Tom Joyce, Head of the Capital Markets Strategy Group, to discuss his recent presentation on the transition to MidCycle. It's Thursday, September 30, 2021. Great to have you here, Tom.
Thank you, Haley. Thank you to all of the listeners out there. Of course, Haley was an integral part of the team that put this publication together. If you have not received it, please let us know. It's a 100-page policy, economic, and market outlook. Let me take you through some of the key themes in that presentation, the transition to mid-cycle. First of all, what do I mean by the transition to mid-cycle? To focus in on that, I would highlight that of the 35 U.S. economic recoveries since 1854, the two longest have been in the last 30 years. We had nearly 10-year cycles in the 1990s and the 2010s. And we find ourselves only 19 months into this recovery and already entering mid-cycle. How did we get there so quickly? And what does it mean? Well, first of all, the main reason we got there so quickly, mid-cycle that is because of the extraordinary amount of monetary and fiscal stimulus, although much of it was needed. On the monetary side, the Fed, of course, has doubled its balance sheet from 4 to 8 trillion plus over the time of the COVID crisis, the last 18 months. And the US government has already passed into law over 6 trillion of fiscal stimulus, with another 2 to 3 trillion expected before year end. With the sheer amount and velocity of money that generated, M2 money supply increasing by 5 trillion over the COVID period alone, of course, the economic and market recovery was accelerated. What is the meaning of being in mid-cycle, and why do we focus on it? Well, when you get to mid-cycle, it doesn't mean that recession is near. In fact, the base case scenario is that recession is still many years away. However, it does mean that economic and earnings growth tend to decelerate. Market volatility tends to pick up. Market returns vis-a-vis early cycle, when the market's anticipating peak growth, market returns tend to decline, and policy pivots toward tightening. And that is exactly what is happening right now. And against that backdrop, both the fact that we are entering mid-cycle and because we are dealing with some supply side challenges, we are, of course, over the last year, on this accelerating recovery, have arguably had the strongest positive demand shock since World War II. And the supply side of the equation is struggling to catch up to the demand shock that has occurred in both the United States and globally. And with that has come higher inflation, which I'll get into toward the end of the podcast, as well as supply chain dislocations. And against that backdrop, the market has begun to reassess the growth outlook for the rest of the year and next. And so one of the key themes that we highlight in the publication is this idea of decelerating growth from peak, growth past peak, and this idea that growth for the rest of this year and next year, while strong, while arguably 2 to 3 times normal growth in the United States in particular, is still significantly lower than what we had been expecting as recently as in May, June. Of course, the proliferation of the Delta variant has also been an important part of the story. Just to give you a few numbers on that, the United States a year ago, prior to the release of the Pfizer vaccine, the expectation for US growth in 2021 was somewhere in the area of 3.5%. By May, June, prior to the Delta variant really picking up steam in the West, prior to the rising in inflation and the more extreme supply chain bottlenecks, expectations for US growth by May, June had risen to north of 7%. And the market has since reassessed the consensus view for US growth for the rest of this year to be somewhere in the 5.5% to 6%. So the market is repricing growth. We see it repricing growth expectations. We see it in cyclical stocks, in Chinese stocks, in value shares, in a whole host of areas that are high beta to the economy. At the same time, policy activism and risk is elevated. and you don't need to turn too far beyond Washington to really appreciate some of the more acute policy risk in the market. Let's take them one at a time. I think the one that we're most concerned about near term is debt ceiling risk. I would define that risk as not really concern about US default. We think that's exceptionally low likelihood, but more concern about how we get there to resolving the debt ceiling and a standoff between Democrats and Republicans that may play out in a more aggressive manner than markets are comfortable with. Much of this will be resolved in the course of mid-October, and it will probably require Democrats reopening the reconciliation bill and doing a Democrat-only vote to increase the debt ceiling sometime in the 10 days prior to the October 18th deadline that Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has outlined. Infrastructure. We are expecting significant multi-trillion US infrastructure spending across two bills. The first bill is a $1.2 trillion bipartisan bill with both Republicans and Democrats on board. That is traditional hard infrastructure, bridges and tunnels and roads and ports and highways. About half of that 1.2 trillion is new incremental spending. And while it will be a benefit to the economy, it will be less of a benefit than prior rounds of fiscal stimulus during the COVID recovery, because much of these funds will be allocated over an 8 to 10 year period. And for this first step, there will not be tax code increases required to fund. The second step, we are expecting perhaps a slightly larger bill, call it in the 1.5 to 2 trillion area. These are big, big numbers. And it's going to be very difficult for moderates within the party, of the Democratic Party, and the more progressive wing to agree on a number. But the baseline view is something in the area of 1.5 to 2 trillion of what we would call soft infrastructure, more of a focus on social programs, green energy, and climate change. And those programs, much of that spending will in fact have to be financed with increases to the US tax code. So that gets us to our third policy point, and that is tax code changes. And just to get to the punchline, let me say this. Tax is never easy to do. It is very complex, and the vested interests to changing the tax code tend to be very strong. But we do believe going into a midterm election year that it is an imperative for Democrats to get something large done on social infrastructure and to finance it significantly with increases to the US tax code, difficult as that may be. And in the base case scenario, our view is that the US corporate statutory rate is going to increase to the 25% area, that the overseas GILTI rate on global intangibles is going to increase to the 15 to 16% area, that the US government is in fact going to adopt an approach toward a country-by-country minimum tax. We do anticipate capital gains, the capital gains tax increasing, though not as much as Biden has proposed. We see the sort of natural ceiling for that in the 25 to 28% area. And in order to achieve the votes required to get this across the finish line, we do anticipate some changes to the SALT tax, the state and local tax deductions that were limited during the Trump tax reform of 2017. We do think that some sort of relaxation of those deductions, possibly a doubling of their size from 10,000 to perhaps 15 to 20,000, and secondly, allowing both partners in the marriage, or said another way, the elimination of the marriage penalty by allowing both members of the family to receive the deduction. I'll conclude with a few final comments on probably the question in this publication that we received the most, and that is inflation transitory? And how significant will the supply chain dislocations be? And on this question, at a sort of macro level, given the limited time of our podcast, allow me to say the following. Number one, I think it's quite important that we redefine what we mean by the term transitory. Historically, when the Fed has made allusions to transitory as a term, there's a general connotation that that time period is approximately 2 to 3 months. We think in this case, depending on the top part of the market and the economy that you're talking about, transitory can mean somewhere between 12 and 18, maybe even 24 months. This will take longer, even if it is temporary. And in that case, we really need to redefine transitory. Secondly, I think it's really important that we differentiate between the macro and the micro. And so while CPI numbers and ISM numbers may suggest that we are past peak inflation, that we are past peak supply chain dislocations, I think it's actually more important to say that there are some industries where things are improving rapidly, and there are others where they are still getting considerably worse. Yes, CPI numbers have stabilized, but I would remind you that container shipping prices, for example, have increased more than 10 times in recent months. So we need to differentiate between regions of the global economy, between industries, and between services and manufacturing. Thank you so much, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue with you in the weeks and months ahead.
It's been great hearing from you, Tom. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Hallie.
Thank you for listening to the MUFG Global Markets Podcast. Rate, review, and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And reach out to your MUFG sales representative for any further information. Check back soon for more insights from the Global Markets Research Team.